that's going to be the focus of today's episode. Construction projects in Massachusetts has been the bloody pit. That's what they call it, Hoosac Tunnel. More than 200 people. Not so much.
The story of the Hoosac Tunnel is not a story I can really tell in a typical Fishing Historic Places episode, and so we're starting a whole new product line here, and we're going to call it Remembrance Moments, which might allow me to do a little bit of living history or reenacting or bring in some of my buddies that do that, maybe even a little music. The point is, right now we're going to work on the Hoosac Tunnel and some of the stories that go along with it. It's hard to believe that the Hoosac Tunnel was originally imagined as a tunnel that would carry a canal through the Hoosac Mountain. During the early 19th century, before the railroads, there was a canal building rage gripping the east coast of the United States, the most famous of which was the Erie Canal. And of course, Boston, trying to compete with New York, as it always does, decided on their own canal, of which the Hoosac Tunnel was to be a part. These were a different kind of people back then. It's hard to imagine the gall that they had, thinking that they could connect the Connecticut River watershed up the Deerfield, through a mountain 4.5 miles long to the Hoosac River, and then down to the Hudson. These were big men thinking big thoughts, and the Hoosac Tunnel was the real key to the problem. They abandoned the idea, which probably wasn't a bad thing, considering that the investors would have lost their shirts because a new technology was on the horizon, and that was the locomotive. With the completion of the tremendously successful and thought impossible Boston to Albany Railroad, or the railroad to the moon across the Berkshires, Hoosac Tunnel planners got back into the game. Investors from up in the northern reaches of Massachusetts, industrialists, felt that a railroad by a more northerly route to Albany would be better for them and their businesses. And the tunnel began again. This second attack on the problem of boring a tunnel through Hoosac Mountain is really the brainchild of Alva Crocker, who was a very innovative and successful mill owner from Fitchburg, Massachusetts. And he wrangled with the state legislature. And if you know about Massachusetts, it is and has been for centuries an extremely political and often corrupt state. And Alva wrangled and fought with the Western Railroad and other business interests who wanted to restrict the railroad to their sphere of influence. But Alva persevered, creating several corporations, greasing the right palms, filing the right paperwork, and ultimately the tunnel began. His big move, really, though, was being instrumental in the hiring of Herman Haupt, a talented young engineer who would bring with him some great ideas about the more modern techniques in tunnel drilling, like the Burley drill. Now, this fit right in with Crocker's ideas, as he had done this sort of thing as a mill owner. This is a time, and you have to kind of just be amazed at it, where people didn't have tools just hanging around and say, okay, well, I can use that one. What they needed to do was invent their own tools to make it happen. And that's what's going to happen with the Hoosac Tunnel. It's a fascinating period. I guess I should say fascinating looking back at it, because if you were one of the tunnel crew members, you were in there working with a sledgehammer, a hand chisel that would be struck by that sledge, and when you opened up a deep enough hole, you'd fill it with powder, put wax on the top with a wick in it, and get the heck back behind whatever cover you could, and it was going to blow up. And you weren't going to be able to get out of that tunnel when the explosion occurred. You're going to be in there. So there were some ears ringing. And many workers paid with their lives in accidents caused by the black powder. Now, Herman Haupt, who was the power engineer of the project and really got it going,
was called away by the American Civil War, spending 2 years in the Army as a colonel, later a general, and basically superintendent of the railroads of the Eastern Theater. So without Haupt, new engineers came in to fill the void and met with the same problems. Interestingly, the eastern quarter of Hoosac Mountain is made of schist, and as you move into the interior you meet gneiss, and then finally the western quarter of the mountain, let's say, is what's called limestone. And if you know anything about limestone, it will dissolve when exposed to water. And while earlier geologists had informed the engineers that they wouldn't have any problem with water, that entire west leg of the tunnel project was fraught with cave-ins, slurry. The ceiling would literally dissolve as they drilled into it. And it created all kinds of problems, ultimately leading them to decide to put up wooden framing to try to keep the work crews safe from cave-ins and collapses, to finally bricking the entire maybe last mile or western mile of the tunnel. So the Hoosac Tunnel was actually built from 3 directions, with work occurring on the eastern side, the western side, and finally through a central shaft that they figured they'd need as a result of the coal exhaust that would probably fill the tunnel with noxious fumes that might end up killing engineers, passengers, brakemen, and thus they began the construction of that central shaft straight down toward the tunnel from more than 1,000 feet above. And it's that central shaft that would cause the greatest single accident in the tunnel's history. To keep water out of the vertical central shaft and to protect the steam engine and elevator equipment that would allow men to get up and down to the work area at the base of the shaft, they constructed basically a barn over the top of the shaft. The barn quickly became a storehouse for all the various tools, etc., that would be needed in the tunnel's construction. And then, one sad day, with a crew down below, the unthinkable happened. With 13 men down the shaft, more than 500 feet below the Earth's surface, a fire started in the barn above, and a subsequent explosion which hurled tools and debris down the shaft upon the hapless miners. The shaft quickly began filling up with water as the pumps stopped. As soon as debris from the flaming barn stopped smoking, rescue efforts began. And don't we all have a crazy friend? Well, in this case, the crazy friend to some of the miners down below was a gentleman named Tom Mallory. And it does kind of make sense that in the mid-19th century, if you got a dirty job to do, who do you get to do it? An Irishman you do. And they basically tied him to a rope with some lanterns strapped to him and lowered him down more than 500 feet. He passed out because of lack of oxygen. They realized something was up and brought him up and were able to revive him. He reported nobody could have survived that ordeal down there. But despite that, went down several more times. With no pumps to remove the water that was rapidly flooding the central shaft or any way to get air down there and all the primitive infrastructure destroyed by the fire, it'd be more than a year before they would finally be able to get down and find out the fate of the 13 men below. And what they found was shocking. Several men had cobbled together a raft and were found their bodies floating on a pool of water many feet deep at the base of the central shaft. Now, the disaster took place in mid-October of 1867, and it was immediately after that disaster that men in the work camps and tunneling down below began reporting the sound of muffled cries and wails in the night and in the deep dark of the tunnels. And I believe this is probably where the legend of Hoosac haunting began. A former Union cavalry officer now working for the tunnel project was sent in to investigate these ghostly cries shortly after the accident, and he reported upon returning to the daylight that he had not been so scared since Shiloh. If you know about Shiloh, you know the face of fear. After the central shaft disaster, accidents would continue as the work on the tunnel progressed. But now these accidents would be accompanied by ghostly apparitions, strange cries in the darkness and in the night, blue lights that would flicker in the distance and disappear, and strange voices that sometimes warned of danger. The tunnel became known as the Bloody Pit by the work crews. By the time it was finished in October of 1875, it had claimed approximately 200 lives. When completed, the Hoosac Tunnel was the second longest railroad tunnel in the world and still is the longest railroad tunnel in the United States east of the Rocky Mountains, a source of tremendous pride to the men that struggled in the Bloody Pit and those that engineered it and made it happen. And even to the great state of Massachusetts, which needs something to get the title great, as it has constantly been bested by its neighbor, New York. I hope you enjoyed our Fishing Historic Places Remembrance Moment, focusing on the Hoosac Tunnel, and invite you to check out our channel, like and subscribe, as they say, and maybe even share. We've got another fishing video that integrates a little bit of history and a little bit of fishing at the Bloody Pit. So check us out, and thanks for watching.